Hello, welcome to this week's reflections on the Acts of the Apostles. Last time we finished up the recording where we had just started chapter 18. More highlights than really getting to the depth of the chapter, but Paul had just left Athens by himself, leaving behind some of his helpers to continue the work of the church there. And he travels to Corinth, which in Paul's day and age would ostensibly be the sin city of that era. So Paul is in Corinth, and at the same time what's been going on in the 40s, there has been some resistance by the Jewish community to some of the things the emperor has been doing, and the emperor has declared that all the Jews have to get out of Rome, basically. So Paul is going to end up meeting a couple of other people because of that. So there's a sense that God has put these people together. You know, the timing is just too coincidental for Paul to have left Athens to travel to Corinth, for this couple to have been told to leave Rome, and they end up in the same place that Paul is at the same time. So Paul is going to work in Corinth in addition to his preaching and teaching, which is not uncommon for Paul. And Paul, along with this couple, is their common trade is tent making, or better descriptive is just leather working. So there was probably more than just creating tents, but that's mostly what we know of as Paul when he worked in on the side to support himself in order to do God's work in the preaching and the teaching. And most tents that day were constructed of leather, but yet the meaning of the Greek word has extended to refer to an artisan who produces a variety of leather articles. Jewish rabbis typically were bivocational, so that they would not have to charge for their teaching, while other traveling preachers in the Hellenistic world received payments for their lectures. Well, Paul has not been licensed to do that kind of thing, to be paid, so he is engaging in this leather work so that he can offer the gospel without charge. And in Greco-Roman culture, the manual labor of the artisan class was kind of shunned a bit, even though I'm sure they all used leather products. So it's an interesting dichotomy. People want to use their products, but they kind of shun the workers. Well, Paul probably also set up his workshop in a public arena, not just to sell goods, also as a place where he could witness to the gospel, as some Greek philosophers also used theirs as a teaching location. So his departure from the workshop and exclusive devotion to preaching after Timothy and Silas arrived from Macedonia probably shows that he did not view his paying job as an essential to his evangelism strategy. Perhaps he found another source for financial support. Maybe Timothy and Silas joined in working with Priscilla and Aquila and the leather goods making business. But when Timothy and Silas arrived from Macedonia, likely they could have brought Paul also a monetary gift from the previous congregations. And Paul can now be exclusively devoted to preaching, literally the word, as it says in the Greek. Paul's work now is to engage in gospel apologetics. And that, if you know what apologetics are, it's not just apologizing and saying I'm sorry. It's using words to describe and validate what's happening. So gospel apologetics would be the use of preaching and teaching to bolster and support the gospel, and so people know, even by using reason and persuasion, that the proclamation, the testimony Paul is giving, is that the Messiah is Jesus the Christ. And for Jewish people, that's a big deal, because still to proclaim Jesus as the crucified Messiah would have been for them an oxymoron, because Messiahs didn't get crucified. Messiahs took over and did their work on behalf of the state of Israel. So the familiar pattern of the gospel confrontation with Judaism, that is, the proclamation, the division, the rejection, the separation, the further advance, that all occurs in a pretty rapid successions. And the Jews, not all of them, of course, because some converted to the gospel, but some of the Jews become abusive. They oppose Paul's gospel. They oppose Paul and his preaching and teaching. They blaspheme the message of the gospel and the Lord Jesus Christ, who is at the center of the gospel. So what Paul does is described as shaking out his robes. And that's a symbolic way of Paul saying that he disassociates himself from those Jews who are attacking the gospel, and for several reasons. He wants to be clear of the judgment that their blasphemy will incur. Clear of, meaning be far away from. He wants them to know that their rejection of the gospel message places them in the same position as the Gentiles, facing judgment. So Paul wants to declare his freedom from any further responsibility for their eternal destiny. Basically shaking out his robes, we might say, hey, I'm washing my hands of this whole thing. So their guilt and their coming punishment, as far as Paul's concerned, are their own responsibility. It's consequences of their choices and their actions. So Paul completes his mission to the Jews in Corinth, though he will continue it in other cities. He hasn't given up on all Jews, but he does shake his robes out against those who are directly in opposition to him. So Paul will now focus on the Gentiles in Corinth. His base of operations will be the house of God-fearer Titus Justus, who lives next door to the synagogue. God has protected God's mission by giving it an ideal home for converting Gentile God-fearers. Even Crispus, the synagogue ruler, holding a highly visible position of supervising worship services and maintaining order, and his entire household believed in the Lord. So then many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. So moving on then, starting look at more directly at verses 9 through 11. Earlier along the journey, Paul has received guidance and encouragement in visions from the Lord. Now the Lord appears to him at night again with a threefold command attached to a threefold promise, all expressed in biblical language. Do not be afraid, or in literal language, the words would be, stop being afraid, and I am with you. That's the first one. And then the second command is keep on speaking. No one is going to attack and harm you. So command and promise, command and promise. And the third is do not be, or literally do not become silent. The command, the promise, because I have many people in this city already. So a couple of questions. How many of you believe that with God all things are possible? Don't raise your hands, I can't see you anyway. And the other question is, how many of you ever said or thought, God, I can't do that? Those two kind of oppose each other, don't they? If you believe all things are possible with God and then say, God, I can't do that, you're kind of in opposition to what your own beliefs are saying. So this is the dilemma that Paul faced in Corinth. For Paul, or for us, to be afraid is to doubt the risen Lord. That idea, all things are possible. Though Paul has geographically moved beyond the Macedonian call in Corinth, the Lord continues to guide him, telling him, keep on speaking, keep on preaching. So Jesus promises Paul that no one is going to attack you, no one is going to harm you. Therefore, Paul is not to become silent. The Lord has already chosen many people in this town, in this city, as his own. So Paul can feel confident that his preaching and teaching will be secure and it will bear fruit. So this does guarantee a fruitful ministry, and it demands that Paul fulfill the obligation to witness to the Gentiles. And so he does, teaching the word of God in Corinth for 1.5 years, it says in verse 11. So consider this, pardon me. What if Jesus has already chosen many people for his own in this city where I am, or whatever city you may be in, because I know it's more widespread across the nation with people watching this. What if Jesus has already spoken to people in their hearts, and he's already chosen people for his own? And Jesus, as you may have said you believed, with him all things are possible, calls you to talk to them. And your immediate response is, oh, no, Jesus, I could never do that. Well, doesn't then your fear lead you to doubt that all things are possible with Jesus? Because it doesn't say, with God all things are possible, except when he wants me to do something I'm not comfortable doing. You see my point? Well, to further that, less than 1% of the population just here in Sun City Center comes to worship at Redeemer on Sunday mornings. Less than 1%. Now, there are also about 10 other Christian churches within Sun City Center proper, and that doesn't even allow for some of the other surrounding cities that are close enough to drive to go to another church. So even allowing for a guess that some of those other 10 here in Sun City Center have more than 200 in worship on any given Sunday, I feel safe in saying that less than 20% of the population of Sun City Center goes to one of those churches on Sunday morning. Now, other statistics that are a little more verifiable than just my random thoughts. A Gallup poll in 2019 said that 36% of Americans said they went to worship in the past 7 days. Then the pandemic hit in 2020, which negatively impacted that statistic. It negatively impacted all the churches all across the world. And we all suffered because of that. So most recently, the poll after the pandemic places the number down to 30% of Americans that say they went to worship in the last 7 days. So down from 36% to 30%. Now, let me follow along that train of thought, those polls, just for the sake of argument, and to allow that somewhere in the 30 to 36% of the population of Sun City Center goes to worship somewhere each week. What about the other 60 to 70%? So that means that 6 or 7 out of 10 people that you may know, that you may see on your day-to-day busyness around whatever city you live in, if it's not Sun City Center, are not going to worship in any given week. Now, think again about that initial question. What if Jesus has already chosen many people from that 60 to 70% for his own in this city, or whatever city you're living in? And Jesus, whom we probably said, yeah, we believe with Jesus all things are possible, calls you to talk to them. If it is not fear that stops you from inviting them, what does? Well, let me jump ahead in the Gospels, in the New Testament, to Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. And listen to what it teaches us about. It says, a great multitude that no one could count from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. How are those people going to get there? If today's Christians do not proclaim these promises and obey the commands of God. If Jesus can tell Paul in Sin City, Corinth, I've already selected many people as my own, you need to go and tell them about the gospel, why would we believe Jesus can't do the same thing here? Jesus calls the church, and by this I don't mean buildings, I mean the people, to go to all the world, not stay within our own buildings with people we already know. One quote I read said that we will never change the world by going to church, the building. We will only change the world by being the church. Okay, I've harped on you long enough about that. So let's move on. The state now in verses 12 through 17 kind of get involved, but because they're pushed into it. So verse 12 says to us that the Jews, and again it's not all Jews, it's just those that are opposing Paul, the Jews made a united attack on Paul. Well, this isn't anything new. It's been going on with Paul for some time. I'm sorry, I didn't do my business here again. This is not anything new. It's been going on for Paul, but this time they literally bring him into court to stand before the judgment seat. And he stands, in this case, before the judge who is Lucius Junius Gallio, excuse me. He was proconsul who sat in the judgment seat. And a series of inscriptions help us to date this, his term of office and his duration fairly precisely, for as well as you can for that period. Gives us a good secular evidence for placing Paul in Corinth between AD 49 and AD 51. Paul probably appeared before Gallio at the beginning of the governor's term of office and near the end of the apostles' stay in Corinth, so predicting somewhere in the year AD 51. The Jews, in this case, who opposed Paul, bring an ambitious charge that Paul is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Whew, that's a big charge. Who are the people Paul is persuading? Or better, the charge would have said he's inciting them rather than persuading them. Are they Jews? Are they Gentiles? Are they both? But more to the point, are they even Roman citizens? So, against what law, then, are they being incited to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law? Is it Roman law against proselytizing citizens to foreign cults, the law would have talked about? Or is it the Jewish law, as we find out Gallio understands it? Or is it an application of the edicts of Claudius, that the Jewish people are to be treated as a legal, social, and in this case, a religious ethnic entity whose customs and practices are to be respected and whose lives are to be left undisturbed? Possibly the Jews mean for Gallio to extend Claudius's edict into their eternal affairs. And in their view then, Paul's teaching of the Word of God or the gospel is contrary to Jewish law, and it creates an internal disturbance within the Jewish ethnic religious cult or group. In this sense, the crowd believes that Paul is violating Emperor Claudius's edict. It's a pretty hefty charge to bring against Paul. Now, before Paul even says a word, he's about ready to lift up a defense, but he never gets to it, Gallio decides not to even render a verdict. In other words, it would be like, I don't like comparing it to our own systems, but it would be like if the court system decides they're not even going to hear a case. There's not enough of a case even to have a trial. That's what Gallio decides. God is fulfilling his promise of protection when he told Paul, keep speaking, I will protect you. Gallio evaluates how these charges relate to the spheres of necessary and discretionary jurisdiction. So using technical legal language, he says that some misdemeanor, open or violent wrongdoing, some serious crime and events involving fraud or deception, unscrupulousness, would be a legitimate matter for his jurisdiction. But the Jews have brought him a controversial questions about words, literally a word. This would be the word, the gospel message in verse 11, not deeds, Gallio doesn't want to handle words about names. In other words, he's saying, this is your business. This is not my business. So messianic titles, Jesus' identity as the cross, as pronounced in verse 5, and about Jewish law, he says their own law. Well, they are, in Corinth, it's what Paul was prescribing as a law-free gospel for the Gentiles. So he's not really violating the law by saying the Gentiles are free of the law. But ultimately, Gallio's verdict is, I will not be a judge over such things. Verse 15. So here, Gallio articulates two principles of for the Roman world, church-state relations, that when lived out in any political structure will kind of pave the way for the gospel's unhindered progress throughout the Roman and Greco world. First, by saying that Paul is not accused even of a misdemeanor or a serious crime. Gallio declares Christianity's innocence here and before the state. This is just, as far as the state is concerned, this is an argument over words and names. So, missionary activity is not illegal. Gallio has made this a decision by the courts, if you will. Second, by refusing to judge an internal religious dispute, Gallio declares that the religious questions do not fall within the expertise of secular state powers. Well, for the 40s and 50s of the first century, this was truly a precedent-setting decision. The decision of Gallio would carry influence wherever such issues arose throughout the empire. You can bet Paul would have used this to his advantage if and when necessary. So God is doing more than just simply protecting Paul. God is setting up a protection for all of the first century missionaries. As this word spreads about this decision, all of the missionaries then can relate back and say, well, you know what happened in Corinth. So now, by extension, God has also set up a protection for our own religious liberties from government intervention. As you know, our own First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution follows in this example. I don't know that they ever went all the way back and said, well, this is what happened with Paul in Corinth, but basically it's the same language. When our constitutional First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So even our own constitutional amendments have grown out of this kind of concept that is happening with Gallio and Paul here in the city of Corinth. there's also a dark side to Gallio's lack of involvement. Not only does he eject the defendant and plaintiffs, get out of my court, possibly even he may have had the bailiff escort them roughly out from the court, he also takes no action when, subsequently, the Jews who had been against Paul begin to beat one of their own, Sosthenes, the leader of their synagogue, or a leader of their synagogue anyway. So this breakdown of the law and order within the Roman edict is a warning that the state's hands-off policy in religious matters may also make room for persecutions to continue opposing the gospel. Paul's instructions to Timothy concerning prayer for state rulers should always be on our hearts, whether we agree with their decisions or whether we disagree with their decisions. We're not praying for the actions as such. We are praying for the leaders. Okay, and we always want to pray for the leaders to do God's will. While we also understand that praying for a secular leader does not necessarily signal condoning a decision or action. Okay, we may not like what they did. We can disagree with the action. We can disagree with the decision or the results of the decision and still pray for that leader's ability or at least adhering to God's will. Jesus taught that we need to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. That's not so much our life. We don't get persecuted. Even when we might try to say we're being persecuted, we're not. Paul, he was being persecuted. Other Christians of the first century, they were being persecuted. There are Christians in another part of the world who are literally being persecuted. We need to keep our prayers going. That's the whole idea behind this, even for leaders that we disagree with and leaders we agree with. So, setting that aside now, moving forward into verses 18 through 22. Now Paul has been shielded by the state. Paul remains in Corinth for some time. It said a year and a half earlier. Eventually he left, or better said, farewell to the brothers and sisters, accompanied now by Priscilla and Aquila. He sails for Syria, which is where he started out. And this refers either to his final destination, either he's going to stay in Syria, or to some other eastern territory that includes Judea. So Paul started this second missionary journey from Antioch in Syria, in the city of Antioch, which is in Syria, and at Corinth eastern port, which is Cenchrea, 7 miles southeast, Paul cuts his hair. And that's a very significant thing, but they didn't just throw that in there that Paul got a haircut. This signals the beginning of the end of what is known in the Old Testament times a Nazirite vow. You can look that up in Numbers chapter 6 verse 5, which reads, during the entire period of their Nazirite vow, no razor may be used on their head. They must be holy until the period of that dedication to the Lord is over. They must let their hair grow long. Well, now we're getting the seemingly small detail that Paul cuts his hair. So there's a signal here that what Paul set out to accomplish with whatever Nazirite vow he took, it is now over. So he cuts his hair. So apparently Paul had begun his vow after either the Macedonian or the Corinthian vision as a sign of an earnest pleading to the Lord for success in the mission to which Paul has been called. Now, Paul had to know what he was walking into. So he makes a vow, pleading for success. You know, it would be as if any of us were called upon the Lord to go into a situation where we don't expect to succeed and we're fearful. That's what Paul's doing. So now we know he made an actual Nazirite vow. So now in Thanksgiving, Paul ends the vow and recognizes the Lord did make good on his promises. So in our life and faith, we too may be confident that what the Lord calls on us to do, God will enable us to complete. Philippians 1:6 reads, "He who began a good work in you will carry it to completion until the day of Jesus Christ." So I want to stop and leave it right there. Thank you for joining me again this week as we continue our journey through the Acts of the Apostles. We're still in chapter 18. We haven't completed it. See if I can get it finished next time. But again, I hope you're having a great week. If you're in the area, join us Sunday for worship. Take care. God bless.